So last night I was talking about silence, the silence that we're practicing in a physical way during these 2 days, but also the silence that we discover, which is not just the absence of noise, not just the result of restraining ourselves from talking, controlling the tongue, but that silence which in the mystical traditions is the fullness of life and the fullness of truth. As Meister Eckhart says, there is nothing so much like God as silence. So I think as we look at this question of experience and how we make meaning out of experience, this question of silence is very helpful. It helps us to make sense of our lives. And perhaps one of the problems in much of our modern culture and the crisis that we're going to be looking at in the seminar is that we have rather lost the taste for silence and the meaning of silence. We're more likely to feel that silence happens when something isn't working. You turn on the TV and nothing happens, it's broken. So silence is a mistake in some way, or it's only a step towards communication. I remember years ago when we were in Montreal and Yehudi Menuhin came to meditate with us. He was a great musician, and he meditated with us, and afterwards I was struck by what he said about, because he said, so you had the whole time in meditation, the whole time in silence. So I said, yes, that's how we do it. And he was a very deep and amazing man. But he said that, I always think of silence as the background, sort of a blank page or something on which music or thought or art will emerge. And I've thought about that for many years, and I think it's partly true, but it's silence in itself has a real completeness, a real totality, a real something, nothing like God as silence. And so perhaps anyway, as John Main said, one of the things that we have perhaps most urgently to recover today for the health and well-being of our world is this experience, the experience and the meaning of silence, he says. A few weeks ago I was in South America, which is their winter, and going from different temperatures, I ended up getting a sore throat and found that my voice was disappearing, which may have been good news for some people, but it was a bit discomforting for me. And it was getting weaker and weaker, and we were just about to start a retreat, so I decided I would really minimize my speaking until the retreat started. And I was at a lunch with some people on the way to the retreat, and I said to them, I'm not going to speak very much because I can't. So they said, okay, and it was very interesting because at first nobody else would speak. I think it's being a bit like being with somebody with a disability, and you don't want to do what they can't do. You know, you sort of sympathize, or you, out of respect, so they weren't speaking. Then, anyway, people started speaking, and I interacted as much as I could. But I realized that by not saying anything in response to what people were saying, I became a very much better listener. And I was really listening to what they were saying and had time, space to think about it. And also, I think they, because I wasn't interrupting them, or I wasn't even just saying, oh yes, that's interesting, or I wasn't in any way blocking the flow of their speech, they were able to, they seemed to me, more freely. So, but there had to be that element of silence to make that communication really effective and really flow. So, there are two aspects to silence then. There is this discipline of silence that we have lost, or this taste for silence that has become overlaid with our taste for constant communication, constant radios, constant mental stimulation, and checking our messages and so on. But there's that, and that creates, I think, especially for children and young people, creates problems that we as adults often don't notice at first. We don't realize that children actually like silence. As a man told me once, he got into the car in the morning to take his son to school. And normally they just had this routine, daily routine. He got in the front seat, the son got in the back, and the father turned on the radio, as he always did. And this morning, his son said, "Dad, would you turn the radio off, please?" And his father was so surprised, he didn't even say why. He just obediently turned off the radio, and they drove to school without it. So I think that says something about why children have this natural capacity and interest and attraction to meditation, and ask for it. Many teachers tell me that when the children move from one year to another, they complain if they're not getting their meditation time. They'll say to the new teacher, "When are we going to do our meditation?" So that says something, perhaps, about the way in which culturally we have become too noisy. So that's one aspect of silence. But the other aspect, if you like, which we see reflected in the mystical tradition, is that silence in itself is something complete, comprehensive, and deeply fulfilling in itself. Nothing so much like God as silence. So, I'd like to explore that a little more today and pick up this idea of the relationship between the experience and our need for meaning and how we understand meaning at all. In the one of the unpronounceable Upanishads, Brihadaranyaka, which means the great forest. It was the great forest Upanishad. A husband is a dialogue between a husband and wife. And the husband begins by saying to his wife, "The time has come for me to go forth from the worldly life. Come, my dear, let me divide my property among the family, I suppose." And he recognizes in this short statement the fourth stage of life in the Indian traditional classical vision. Apparently, this sense of the four stages of life was formulated first in about the 5th century BC, which is what's often called the axial age. This was the age where the great religions, as we think of them today, took their shape. This was the age of the Buddha, the Hebrew prophets, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Plato. So, did I forget anybody? And the Upanishads. So, these 4 stages of life correspond to, bother with the Indian names, but the first is that of the student. So this is the first stage of life where you're learning and character is being developed, and you hope you have good teachers, and your emotional and intellectual life is being shaped, and your religious life. And then the second stage is that of the householder. So this is where you've trained in a certain field of activity, you know what you're meant to do, what you want to do, and you get married and you start raising a family, and you do your work at home and professionally. And then the third stage is that of the hermit. So this is, or retirement. This is a stage of maybe of gradual withdrawal from society, even from family duties. This is the age of grandparenthood, where you renounce, or you are renounced, from the attachment to familiar sources of pleasure. So your life is being simplified, but you are also finding a new meaning, a new depth, a new purpose, and a new source of joy or pleasure. But you retire from professional life, competition, career, and you find a forest hut somewhere. And so the husband in this Upanishad was probably saying to his wife, who was an obedient wife in that tradition, so, okay, dear, we're going off to a hut in the forest tomorrow. And she presumably would not have argued with him. So, but the idea here is that this is something you do, if circumstances permit, you do with your spouse.
Not really.
Well, sometimes. Okay. Well, let's come back to that, because otherwise we get into too much of a discussion now. Anyway, it doesn't have to be with the spouse. No, definitely, but the spouse can go with him. But then the fourth stage is that of, it's called sannyasa, which is total renunciation, sort of a cosmic, you develop a cosmic identity rather than a social, cultural, or individual identity, and this is often associated with wandering. So you cut off from any familiar anchors in your identity. So these are seen often as the 4 stages, and we could talk about them further later. You can tell us more about it. But each stage of this cycle or journey of life brings a new challenge, of course. You can't move into one stage without detaching from another. Life is often about this interplay between attachment and detachment. There's always some form of attachment. If you fall in love, you have become deeply attached. If you commit yourself to an ideal, you're strongly attached to that ideal. But attachment can easily lead us astray. We can become controlling, egotistical. It can become our ego project, a vanity project. We can become over-controlling parents or spouses, and so on. So attachment is inevitable and is necessary, but at the same time has to be carefully monitored. And maybe that's what daily meditation can help us to do. It enables us to live the commitments, the attachments of our lives without those attachments becoming dysfunctional or excessive. And detachment is an essential part of that process, because we can't fulfill the commitment unless we have a good measure of detachment. And we can't also move to the next stage of life unless we let go of the previous stage. And there may be dramatic moments where that happens, your retirement party or the loss of something precious to you. So there may be dramatic milestone moments, but it's also, of course, a process that unfolds over time, and during which we inevitably make many mistakes and false steps. So, but at each stage of this journey, we could say that there are new challenges and painful transitions, and each of them has a different kind of experience associated with it. I was saying yesterday that meditation itself is an experience. It's a way of experience, not a theory. You do it, you practice it. It's like a sport, or art. You do it. Don't just think about it. Or riding a bike. So it's a practical practice. And that word practice is always, in some traditions, specifically refers to doing it, the practice. So, and I was saying that that is certainly experiential, but it is a different quality, a different kind of experience from what we often think of as the experiences of our lives. So in what way is it different? In what way does this contemplative mind, generated over time through the practice of meditation, in what way is that a different kind of experience? It's not opposed to the other kinds of experience, rich, diverse experiences in life, physical, mental, social, artistic, but it's at the same time different from them. Maybe it's, again, similar to the different levels of consciousness that the Indian tradition also speaks about. There's the state of deep dreamless sleep, of which you can't remember anything. It's like being under anesthetic. You usually don't remember anything when you wake up. So that deep level of sleep, I forget what the doctors call it, that deep level of sleep. Then there's the dreaming state, dreaming sleep, where you dream, have very strong experiences in your dreams, very real at the time. And then you also have the waking state, when you crawl out of bed in the morning and you start the daily activities and everything that happens during the day. But then there is a fourth state of consciousness, which is separate but also includes the others. Turiya, I think it is. So this fourth state of consciousness is different from the others, but it's not separate from them. So maybe that's a way of beginning to understand how meditation can be experiential, but a different kind of experience from the ones we normally think of as the experiences of my life, or an interesting or a painful, or the different labels we give to our experience. Those labels can change, of course, over time. What seems like a disappointment or a failure as an experience today, in a year's time, may look very different. You say, well, that was painful, but it was a good transition to something else. So if there is a parallel, this kind of these stages of experience that relate to our human development are really what it means to be human. If there is a parallel to these stages in the animal kingdom, I don't think we are aware of it. Animals don't seem to go, I don't think, maybe two elephants, they seem to have some parallels, but it's unlikely that two elephants, husband and wife, would sit and have this conversation that begins the Upanishad today. So, yet different as they are, these stages of life make up a single experience of our human personal journey over time. They are distinct in themselves: youth, middle age, late middle age, old age, the final stages. They are distinct in themselves, but they are also part of a whole from which they cannot be separated. It's like a series of books or novels which the author says you can read any one of these and it's a standalone, so you can enjoy it in itself. So you could begin with the fourth novel in a series of 10 books and enjoy it for itself, and of course then he hopes that you get hooked and you buy all the others. So that we can see and appreciate the distinct stage that we are in, or that we are moving into or moving out of, but we cannot fully comprehend the whole picture until the very end. And until the very end, there is always a surprise possible around the corner that could change the whole picture, or our sense of the whole picture. Wouldn't change the facts, but it might radically change the way we see the whole pattern or picture of our lives. Something can happen at the very end that gives a meaning to the whole of our life that we had not expected before. So, and what is the very end? There's a biological end, of course, where we stop breathing, beyond which no traveller has returned to give us first-hand, well, I suppose we have near-death experiences, but not explicit. It's not possible for us to imagine what it is like beyond that event horizon, that very end of biological life. But in another sense, and again the mystical tradition tells us this, every moment is a death. Our cycle of breathing is a cycle of breathing in life and expiration. Every moment is the beginning of a new stage of our existence. So we live with this very end built in to the whole process. So death is a constant companion. Death is always there, which is why the monastic traditions especially developed this idea of memento mori, the idea of being mindful of death, not as a depressing thing, not as a morbid sort of spirituality, but actually to wake you up and to keep you freshly conscious of what each moment, each day is revealing to you, offering you. So St. Benedict says, keep death constantly before your eyes. How do we do that? Well, one way of doing that without just thinking about our coffin, I mean, some rather morbid traditions, you sort of slept in your coffin to remind you of this. But one way of doing it is not so much thinking about death all the time, but meditating every day, because there is a experience in that practice that certainly changes the way we think about death or feel about death. Many people would say this, that their fear of death, sometimes it's a very pathological fear of death that we have to fight with and that causes great anxiety to us. Most of us keep it safely repressed or suppressed. But I think most people would say that their attitude towards the whole picture of their life, the transition through the different stages of their life that reveals meaning at different stages, so the experience of dying into the next stage of our life changes the way, the meditation changes the way they see that and changes the way they feel about death itself. I met an old monk once who told me he said we should have a holy curiosity about death. So why is that? That's because when we do sit to meditate, we are, in a way, going into a little death. We are letting go of everything that we are attached to, or trying to let go of everything we are attached to at that moment. We could be doing something else. Lots of useful things we could be doing. We could even just be having a nap, or we could be reading a book that we wanted to finish, or we could be answering emails, or we could be doing exercise. You know, we could be doing all sorts of useful, good things. But at the times of meditation, we sort of renounce all of those. We, rather like this Upanishad, we are already anticipating the final stage of our life in a limited way for that half hour. We are going into the forest or into the desert of our heart. You know, in Indian tradition, they speak about the forest. I think in the biblical symbolism, it corresponds to the desert, the mountain. So it's trying to see the balance between the immediate experience and the bigger experience, the whole picture that we can have a sense of, and we need to have a sense of, and I think we hunger for, even though we can't understand it because we can't see the whole picture. But we know the whole picture must be there in some way. That's perhaps what we mean by the spiritual hunger of our time, even though the ways in which we have traditionally described this big picture, religious, our idea of God, so on, and everything associated with that has lost so much of its appeal. Nevertheless, the need for the big picture, for meaning, is still there. Maybe this is also one reason why we are all rather addicted to fiction, whether it's novels or Netflix series. We need this, or whether it's sagas or epics. We are attracted to stories, narratives that may be concerned with ways of life or characters with which we had nothing in common, or it may be soap opera, which is just very, very ordinary and common, and just like our own life, like Coronation Street, or what's the one in... anyway, there's the soap operas and so in all cultures. But whatever it is, we're attracted to these stories because they help us to sense the narrative of our own life by reflecting on what is happening in the lives of these fictional characters. And it could be, and there's, even in those soap operas, there's always something happening. Even in the soap operas where life is, they're just living lives very much like our own, their lives are more interesting than ours on a daily basis. There's always some drama, some flare-up, some tragedy, some great joy, in at least 3 of them in every program, which is not exactly what ordinary life is like. But it's also the reason why we read the Gospels, which describe the life of Jesus, the life cycle of Jesus. The Gospels don't give us much biographical detail about him. Little more comes right at the very end of the story. We somehow feel the story has slowed down in the last 24 hours of his life, and some of the details are very vivid and moving, of course, of his Last Supper, of his trial, of his passion, and so on the cross. We're taken in, but we don't have the biographical details that we would expect today. So his life was told in the Gospels through the main stages, birth, even childhood, a little bit on it, his work, his preaching, his formation of his community, and then and his conflicts, and then his final stage, the very end. So the life is told through his stages of life and his teachings, and it invites us as we read it. It draws us maybe more powerfully than any work of fiction. So this is a narrative, so there's a certain clear fictional hand at work in composing the gospel narratives. But it draws us, I think, to somebody who reads it either with faith or with a completely open mind and has not developed too many filters or preconceptions or prejudices about Christianity, which makes it impossible for them to read it even. But when we read it, we are drawn more deeply, I think, than by any fiction, in to see our own life in him, to make meaning of our own experience, day to day, or in the stages of our lives, as we recognize ourselves in him and him in us. As we enter into that experience, which is another kind of experience of the reading of Scripture and encountering the narrative, the story, the symbols in the Scriptures. I've been reading some Gnostic Gospels recently, and I can, despite what Dan Brown says about, the church persecuting the Gnostics and sort of keeping the big secrets away from the ordinary people, I mean, there's such a huge difference between the Gnostic Gospels and the canonical Gospels, the 4 Gospels we have. And there's just no comparison, really. I mean, there are, say, the Gospel of Thomas, there are features which are come very close to the canonical Gospels, and scholars say that quite possibly they contain sayings of Jesus that were not present or in the canonical Gospels, or the same, come from the same source as the Gospels. But generally there's really no comparison between the effect of reading the Gospels in a considered way, in an unfiltered way, in a direct way. So you pick up the New Testament each time as if it was you were picking up for the first time. There's no comparison, I don't feel anyway, between that and the Gnostic Gospels, which all have a point. They're all making an ideological or mythological point and trying to persuade you about something. But whereas the Gospels, it seems to me, don't try to force you into a belief system, actually. They just show you something, and that what they show you attracts you and engages you, and then meaning is made through the way you react to it, respond to it, and discuss it and share it with others. That's why Lectio Divina, the sharing of the scriptures, is really very powerfully done in community, as well as on one's own. So, and in the Gospel, we don't see the stages of life described as we see it in the Indian tradition. There are really maybe 2 main stages in the Gospel vision of life, very basic, before and after. It's before the beginning of discipleship and after discipleship has begun. And the turning point between the two is when we hear his call to follow him and we respond to it. In the Gospels, this is often described as a very dramatic moment. You know, when Peter and James and Andrew are working on their nets and Jesus just says, "Come and follow me," and they abandon their nets and follow him. There's a famous, beautiful painting of Caravaggio, The Call of Matthew, where Jesus is a rather shadowy figure in the foreground of the picture, but you see his finger pointing to Matthew, who's playing cards in the pub, and Matthew just feels this call, and you know he's going to respond. He's going to leave his card game and follow Jesus. So these are rather dramatic moments, and we do have dramatic moments in our lives where we fall in love or where we see something very clearly which changes the way we live. But generally, I think these stages unfold over time, and they are a mixture often both of attraction, we want to go this way, but we also resist it because we don't know where it's going to take us, and we like to be in control of change. We don't like to surrender too much to the process of change. I think this also explains very much how we learn to meditate. For most of us, for me, and I think for many people, when we began to meditate, it took some time, a long time maybe, before we surrendered, as it were, into the rhythm of the daily practice. And that wasn't because you didn't believe in it. It may be because you did believe in it, and because you were conscious that this, if it was accepted and you did make meditation part of the daily rhythm of life, that this would lead to something that you couldn't yet imagine. There's a story of Carl Jung when he visited India, and he was within a few miles of the great Indian sage Ramana Maharshi, to whom the world was coming at that time, and very authentic, realized human being. And Jung had heard about him, of course, and actually wrote a foreword to a collection of his books. But when he was offered the chance to go to see him, he declined. And I think it's a true story. He explained the reason for this, that he didn't feel ready for it. It could have been too big an encounter. Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago died, I think, in the 1980s. Died as a much loved American character, and the whole of America, not only the Catholic Church, felt a connection with him. And he had gone through he was one of the last great advocates in the American hierarchy of the common ground and of a moderate approach, well, there's not say moderate approach, but a balanced approach to the church's role in society. In other words, not just become obsessed with single issues of abortion, homosexuality, or how the liturgy was done, but to see the whole picture and to what he called the consistent ethic that you carried through the gospel vision into all areas of life. And so he was much a controversial figure, much hated, also despised and vilified by the conservative, these reactionary Catholics who have in some ways taken over the hierarchy now. And he was then, towards the end of his life, he was accused of sexual abuse, and that was a terrible ordeal for him to go through. And he was completely exonerated by it. The person who was accusing him admitted that the idea that this had happened came to him under hypnosis while he was being hypnotized, and it came later to the absolute conviction that, as he said, Bernardin was completely innocent. But nevertheless, this put Bernardin through the worst kind of experience you could imagine. But the meaning that came out of this experience for him was expressed in his last book, The Gift of Peace. And in that, he very movingly describes his own life journey and faith journey, and he describes how for much of his life as a priest and bishop he had been just a careerist, really just, in the church, but in the institution and the hierarchy, and doing good things, but doing them for mixed motives and so on. And then in the last stage of his life, he realized what discipleship meant and what the personal relationship with Jesus was all about. So the stages of discipleship are very personal and are affected by the other experiences of our lives, which may seem to have nothing specifically related to our spiritual life or our religious identity. So experience itself unfolds at different levels, at the day-to-day micro level, and then also at the big level, the macro level, which we cannot see the full picture. And meaning the meaning of our experience, which we hunger for and we need, unfolds or manifests itself again through experience in ways that we cannot predict. So what do we mean by experience? Do we mean zooming in, looking at it under a microscope, analyzing it in detail, or is it the panoramic view, the wide shot, where you pull back and you see as much of the whole landscape as you can? Well, it's both, obviously. This is why when John Main speaks about the experience of meditation, he's telling us something valuable about how we can see the experience of our lives. He says, don't think about meditation in terms of having good meditations or bad meditations. Think of it as meditation practiced faithfully over a period of time. It takes time, of course, for faith to develop. You may make a faithful commitment for 5 minutes. Well, that's better than nothing, but it's not much to write home about. If you take your marriage vows, you don't say to love, honor, serve, and whatever for the next 18 months. If you say, no wonder marriage is on the decline institutionally, because it's until death do us part. Oh, what a... So faith, it takes time for faith to understand what faith means, and for faith itself as an energy and as a way of living to develop. You can't live faithfully just in the short term. Or you can, but then it's always going to be tested and it has to be renewed, for the long term. So meditation, we could see as an experience of faith. A learning experience in which we're not very good. Nevertheless, we are beginning to learn from the daily meditation what faith means, and we do that at the zoom-in level by our sincere attempt to be faithful to our word in this tradition, to the faithful repetition of the mantra is a way of faith. No one says it is the only way, but it is a very real way. And the effect of this, of practicing this, is going to be that it will allow you and help you to live life as a whole in a more faithful way and in every aspect of your life. So there are good and bad meditations, there's no doubt. If you try and meditate when you when you have a cold or a sore throat, or when you are suffering from jet lag, or you didn't get a good night's sleep, then yes, it may not be the best meditation of your life. It may be a lousy meditation. But we can't evaluate it just in at that micro level, because it's part of a bigger journey of faith. And in fact, in that sense, the fact that you were as faithful to it as you could be during that short time, or during that half hour, in that sense, it may be one of the most important meditations of your life, because it was pure faith. It's not like when you have a good meditation, And we could all have more good meditations if we prepared for them better. But if you have a good meditation, inverted commas, when you are sort of sad when the alarm goes, when the timer goes off, and you say, "Oh, I'll continue doing this." Father John used to say, "Don't shorten the meditation because it's going badly, and don't prolong it if you feel it's going well." There's a great wisdom in that, not a easy sort of discipline to follow perhaps, but a real wisdom that reveals the meaning of the experience, whether it happens to be good or bad.